Let me just. And we're ready. Okay. Well, good morning to all. Good evening for those who, like me, are in the UK. Welcome to our next presentation on LIDNUG. We have Dan Wahlin with us this evening. Sorry, I'll get that right. Yeah. Just a few things to do before we continue. As usual, we'll go through the housekeeping and the news. We have some really good news on the horizon as of today, and that is that the new LIDNUG.org website is up and running now. Now, there's not a huge amount there yet, but we've finally got something to show for our efforts. As per usual, upcoming events. We have one more in this month. This is Cohen's Zwicastra, creating a document view with the document toolkit. And in October, we have Getting the Most Out of ASP.NET 4 with Todd Anglin. We've had Todd on before, and it was a very good session, so it should hopefully be very good again. And we have one on F# by Don Syme on October the 27th. Following on from that in November, we have our next Scott Guthrie event, which we have every 3 months. As per usual, you can contact everybody on LinkedIn. You can contact us via our website, and the links for the calendar are there, or on twitter.com/LIDNUG and facebook.com/LIDNUG. Finally, info@lidnug.org is our main email if you wish to contact us. So on behalf of myself and the rest of the team, I'd like to thank Dan for coming along. Dan, are you ready?
I'm ready. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, sir. Take it away and impress us with some Silverlight magic.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I know everybody has busy schedules, so I appreciate you taking a few hour and a half or so out of your day to jump in here. So my name's Dan Wahlin. For those that don't know me, I live in Arizona within the United States, and it's still about 104 degrees, so we're pretty warm still, but it's not bad. It's down from 110. I run a consulting company here called the Wahlin Group, and we specialize in a lot of different things related to .NET, including SharePoint, Silverlight, and ASP.NET in general. But we're definitely spending a lot of our time nowadays on Silverlight. So we're going to talk about some lessons learned and just some good stuff with MVVM here, and why I think it's a good pattern, especially if you're getting into Silverlight, that you might want to consider as you build your Silverlight app. So I added into the handout section, which is somewhere up on your top bar there, the slides. As soon as we get done, I have a post ready to go, and I'll post the sample code I'm going to run for you as well. So we'll get that going. You'll be able to get that here from the blog address. So again, this should be up in the handouts for you. If not, go ahead and jot this down real quick. And if you're on Twitter, definitely let's hook up. And then if you have questions afterwards, here's where you can get a hold of me. So, all right, let me skip past this stuff. And I want to thank LIDNUG and all the people here. I just met a few new folks from there. But Brian and Sid, I might say your name wrong. I'm not sure if that's how you officially say it, but thanks for being patient to get me on here. So, all right, so what are we going to talk about? Well, we have basically an hour and a half, so I'm going to try to leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions. If you do have questions, you can certainly hit that Q&A at the top of your toolbar there and type those in. I'm going to hold off on answering those until the end so that we can keep a hopefully reasonable flow going here and get everybody up to speed on what MVVM is and why do you care. So here's what we're going to talk about. Specifically, we're going to talk about, so what is MVVM and why should you care, number one. And I'll give you some stories about when I first started it, because to be quite honest, I didn't really see the need at the time. Several years later, I definitely see the need, so we'll talk more about that. We'll then get into the specifics on creating view model classes, and we'll talk about what a view model is here in just a moment. Once we get through that, we're going to talk about how to bind it. We'll talk about several different techniques that are available there. And then we'll wrap up with 2 more MVVM topics on messaging and commanding. All right, so a couple rules to start. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about MVVM a lot. I'm sure some of you attending right now are probably doing MVVM, and you'll probably agree with this, what I'll say, if you've already done it. Rule number one when working really with any pattern, but especially MVVM, is there isn't one right way to do this. Contrary to some people you might hear out on the web who like to leave comments and say this or that about a certain pattern, there really is not one right way to do it. Yes, there is a bit of a gray area. I'll try to address some of the best tips and practices that we can add into our code as we get going here. But there's not one right way. That's rule number one. Rule number two, I would highly recommend, I've had several people lately, especially we go into companies and do a lot of mentoring, and Silverlight's been really big with MVVM lately because of understanding the pattern. And some people have tried to jump right into some of the frameworks, which we'll talk about in a moment as well, that support MVVM. I would highly recommend learn how to do it from scratch first so that you understand how it works, then go ahead and jump into a pattern. I think it'll actually be much less overwhelming. Otherwise, if you try to jump into a pattern like a framework like Prism, as an example, which is very good, it tends to be a little bit overwhelming at first if you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is we're going to take a kind of bare bones, ground up approach to MVVM, and I'm going to talk about how to do it without having to have a framework, and then I'll mention some of the frameworks I'd recommend you look at if you want to go ahead and step up to that next level. Okay, so MVVM, which is, of course, the model view model pattern, it's actually very similar to several other patterns out there. But you've all heard of MVC. There's MVP. Microsoft actually has a release coming out for that looks pretty nice for ASP.NET Web Forms. I'm sure some of you currently are using ASP.NET MVC at this time. I happen to be a big fan of that one with jQuery mixed in. And then there's even the presentation model in general, which is very analogous to MVVM. So we'll break down the pieces of MVVM here. But if you've done any of these other patterns, I had actually done MVC a little more before I had done MVVM, and it was kind of a natural swap or natural change to move to this with Silverlight or WPF applications. So one of the things you'll want to do after you've researched how do you actually build an MVVM framework from scratch, how does data binding play into it, view models, and all these other things we're going to talk about. But some of the frameworks that I'd recommend you look at are MVVM Lite, which is kind of a it's a very minimalist approach from Laurent Bougnan, that's a good friend of mine in Switzerland. Awesome framework. I'll pull that. I already have that website loaded up, and I'll pull it up in a moment. I'd highly recommend you at least start with that. Caliburn, Rob Eisenberg is, I call him Genius Boy. Very, very smart when it comes to this stuff, and he has a very cool framework called Caliburn, and there's also a newer version called Caliburn Micro. Prism is, of course, from Microsoft. That started kind of built out of the old CAB days. And then, of course, you can just do custom. And that's what we're going to do in this talk, and then I'll let you guys decide what pattern you think might fit for a framework if you need one. I would, if you're starting a Silverlight project, I'd highly recommend take the time to evaluate these different options, though, because if you don't, you're going to get into it, and you know how that works. Get into a project for, say, 2 or 3 months, and then you find out there's a big roadblock with whatever you chose. And so we spent, on our current project we're working on, which has been going for over a year now, it's a pretty big scale project, that's Silverlight. We spent 2 weeks just on researching one of these frameworks, and actually decided we didn't want to use it, and then we moved on to some other stuff. So we'll talk about that more as I get in here, but I definitely take the time to research them. All right, so let's get this going with MVVM. So the benefits of MVVM. A lot of people, when they first start up Silverlight projects, what they'll do is they'll come in, they'll right-click on the designer, and then they'll add code. And there's nothing wrong with adding code into the code beside the file per se, but if you're into reuse and testability and maintenance and all that good stuff, then really there needs to be a better way to do it. Because if you put all the code in the code behind, it makes it very, very hard to reuse, because now it's locked into that XAML file. And it's definitely a lot harder to test as well. So these are some of the benefits. Separation of concerns. You definitely have more testable code. way better code reuse you can get out of this, and I'll add an extra element into the MVVM that I like to use called the service agent, which we'll talk about that in a moment. It definitely leads to simplified maintenance. One of the big things, I've been working with some big companies lately on kind of walking them through this process, and some of these companies have very large teams, and I'm sure some of you in attendance today work on a pretty large team. The problem when you add the code right into the code beside, and you've probably suffered through this with ASP.NET web forms if you've done that, is that number one, it's hard to test, but number two is if somebody else is trying to work on that file and you're using source control, it can tend to be a little bit tricky to merge those changes. Now, there's certainly, you can use FVN and all these frameworks to do it, Subversion, but it's a lot easier if we can break this stuff out into pieces, and that allows for better source control, better access to it, and better testability. The other big thing you can do with this is you can actually use this MVVM approach to provide sample data as you're walking through your apps. So let's go ahead and move on to the next piece here. So here's the key pieces. The only reason we can even do MVVM as it stands today is because of the Silverlight and WPF data binding model, which we're going to get into in just a bit here. So I'm going to assume that everybody here has at least researched a little bit data binding in Silverlight. If you haven't, I'm going to be using it. I'm not going to talk about it much. I'm going to kind of assume that knowledge, but it's one of the key pieces you'll want to know about when you're working with MVVM. The second enabler for MVVM is, of course, the view model. And the view model really is the glue between your backend, meaning your server, your services, or what we'll call the model, and your XAML files, your code that's going to run and be displayed in screens to the users. And that's really all it is. It's a model for the view, thus the name view model. The other big thing that comes in is commanding. We'll talk about this at the end, but in a nutshell, what commanding is as a user clicks a button in the interface, we're used to that click event gets handled in the code behind. Well, if you're using the MVVM pattern, then you're going to want to do this a little bit different way, because we actually want to route data up to our view model and let that view model actually handle the click event, if you will. There's a little bit different way to do that, and we'll talk about it. And then finally, messaging. And again, we're going to talk about this more at the end, but in a nutshell, messaging is you're going to have multiple view models sometimes that are together used to compose a screen. And you're going to have the situation where one view model needs to talk to another view model, and they might not even know about each other. So how do you do that in a loosely coupled way and communicate between classes that are running? We'll talk about that more at the end, like I mentioned. Very important feature, though. Okay, those are really what I call the four tenets of MVVM. Without these things, it becomes pretty difficult to do some of the things we're going to talk about. All right, so let's talk about the pattern itself and kind of how that pattern breaks down. So here's the three players. You have the model, and the model, I'm going to go ahead and lump that into our business domain. Think of this as the server side. Now, some people view the model as just your entities, your data objects that are going to get exchanged, and some people actually don't even factor in the server side. They'll just count the model as the entities that are loaded locally with Silverlight. But for my presentation today, we're going to go ahead and go with the standard simple approach, which is the model represents our business domain, and I'm going to go ahead and just really simplify it and say this could be your services, your data entities, everything that lives on the server that Silverlight needs to interact with. And that's a very simplified representation of that, but for our purposes it works. Then, of course, you have your view and your view model. So the views are pretty simple. That's your screens. That's your XAML files. But then you have this glue between the screens and the model called the view model. And the view model is really where it's at. So if you've done MVC before, in MVC, whoa, somebody is either clicking my slides or I don't know what's going on there. All right, let's try that again. If anybody accidentally clicked an arrow and you saw the slides move, do me a favor and don't do that again. I don't know why it would let somebody else do it, but looks like it did. Okay, so coming back to this, we have the view model, and the model. And I was saying that there might be some other pieces that you'll integrate into here, but if you've done MVC before, you've probably worked with, well, I know you've worked with a controller. Well, a view model in some ways could be perceived, I guess, as a type of controller. Now, it's quite different in how it works. But really what it does is it orchestrates data, and it gathers the data over from our service over here on the right, brings that data back and stores it within properties that are inside of the view model, and then the view simply binds to the properties of this view model. So the big thing here is that the view is pretty dumb. It literally has no idea where it gets the data. It just gets the data and displays it, and that's how we want it for testability and separation of concerns. The view model, on the other hand, it has no idea about, at least in my opinion, should have no idea about things even as simple as message boxes. To me, a message box popping up or a child window is something that is view specific. It's something that the end user sees. Therefore, that to me goes in the view. The view model itself is responsible for getting the data and storing the data and then acting upon any actions the user might do in the view, such as they click a button. And we'll talk about commanding, where we'll route that over to the view model, and then we might pass up an object up to our server so that we can work with that data, insert, update, delete, whatever that may be. Okay, now I like to add a fourth player into the mix here, so I guess you can call mine the MVVM SA. I like to add something called a service agent. And the service agent is really what I use to communicate with the model. And again, I'm going to define the model in this case as my server, which simplified again is like my data entities on the server. The reason I like to use this particular guy right here called the service agent is, let's say that you have a view model that gets customers, and it stores the customer's collection inside of the view model, and then maybe we have a combo box over here in the view that actually binds to that and displays it in a combo box. Well, if this view model gets customers, and let's say we have another view model down here that also gets customers, and if you hard code the call to get the customers into each view model, you're obviously duplicating your code and your data, and we need to refactor that out. So what I like to introduce into the pattern is something I call the service agent, and other people do very similar things. I mean, really it's just a helper class if you want to keep it simple. But this guy is responsible 100% for data calls to WCF services, to WCF RIA services, whatever it may be. So my get customers will actually live in the service agent, and then the view model will actually call through the service agent to get the customers. And that way, if I have 4 view models that need to get customer data, then I have one place to go to get that data. And you'll see this as I get a little past the more simple demo here, with a little more robust one I have for you that will be available to download. Okay, so let's jump in, and I'm going to jump into a demo in just a sec here. We're going to talk about just a few more slides, then we'll do some demos. And we're going to talk about creating a view model class. And for those that have done it, this will probably be a review for you, but for those that haven't, that's why you're here, and that's what this talk's all about, is what are view model classes, how do you use them, and why are they so important in the MVVM pattern? All right, so what's a view model class? Well, in a nutshell, and I said this earlier with the get customers, it's nothing more than a class that has properties in it, and those properties are going to hold the data that's ultimately going to be bound to our views or our XAML screens. And by doing it this way, number one, we break out all that data. So our views don't know where the data comes from. That's good for separation of concerns. It's good for testability. And it's really good for maintenance, because if John goes on vacation and there's a problem with somehow how the data is being gathered in the Silverlight app, we find a bug or some feature, I should know exactly where to go to locate that. I don't have to scroll through hundreds of lines of XAML code or the code behind to figure out where that data came from. I instantly know, well, first go look at the view model. Okay, so that's the first thing it does. Now, each of these properties, for those that have done a lot with Silverlight, you're pretty familiar with the iNotify property changed. iNotify property changed, for those that aren't familiar with it, is what we use with data binding. You'll see it come into play in just a bit here. So that's the first thing a view model does. Now, there's different approaches to create a view model and use it. So one is, I mentioned earlier, you could have the view model have all the properties that are going to hold the data, plus the view model could be responsible for going out and getting the data itself. So it's all kind of self-contained. And I think in simple apps, there's nothing wrong with that. But as soon as you do a more enterprise, a larger scale app, you'll quickly run into the fact that you're going to be duplicating code across view models. And that's obviously not what we want to do. So the other alternative is, and there's even more than this, like I said, there's not one right way to do this when I started the talk. That's rule number one. But the way I prefer is number two here, which is the view model is responsible for initiating the calls to get data. So it initiates the select calls, the inserts, the updates, the deletes from the client side in Silverlight. It stores the data in the properties. But I like to delegate the responsibility of getting the data into this thing I showed you earlier called the service agent. And so we'll get into that again in just a bit here. So that's kind of your two options. Either the view model does everything, or you kind of like to segregate things out and delegate responsibility over to something like a service agent. Okay, so here, for those that are brand new to it, and then we'll jump into a demo, this is a really simple example of a view model class. So you'll notice right off the bat, it's inheriting from something called view model base, which I'm going to create for you in just a bit to show you how it works. And view model base, I like to do several things in it, but the most important thing is it implements this interface for data binding. You'll see that this particular class called timesheet view model has two properties. These particular properties would need to tie into the Silverlight data binding infrastructure, the engine, and notify controls when a new value is available in first name or last name. And so the view model base is where I'm going to define my interface that handles all that, so I don't have to write that code over and over and over times, say, 50 view models that I might have in my application. Okay, you'll notice that here I have two constructors. Now this is a little bit simplified over what I normally do, but what I could fit in one slide. So the first one is empty. What I normally do here is I have some dependency injection, which we won't get into too heavy today, but I use something called AutoFac right now, which is an open source implementation of what's called an IOC container for Silverlight. And it dynamically injects in what to use for the service agent. In other words, the class that goes out and actually gets the data. But if I want to test, I want to be able to mock fake calls. You know, I want to fake out my calls to my services to be able to test things. So I always have a second constructor where I can pass in any object that implements iServiceAgent. And that gives me the flexibility that in the real app, I can pass the real instance of my service agent, but in a testing scenario, I can actually pass in a class that just mocks it. And so you could use MOQ, RhinoMox, or whatever you like to do to actually go in and test this or mock it, or you can even make a fake one yourself. But that's one thing I always do in my view models, and everybody has a different way to do this, but that's what I like to do. Okay, so the big thing if you're brand new to this point is to understand that a view model is the glue between the screens and your backend services and data and your entity objects. It has properties that store the data, and then in this example that I'm going to show you, we're actually going to delegate out to get the data from another class. Now, the first example I'm going to show you, I'm going to do step one, which is this guy right here, where the view model actually gets its own data, but then I'm going to show you an app that we use the service agent as well. Okay, so now that we've seen that, let me go ahead and try to share my desktop up here. And we'll pop up Visual Studio. And what I like to always do, anybody that takes a class from us, you'll always see a demo pretty similar to this one because it's a good way to start and actually use this. So I'm assuming everybody can see this okay. Peter or anybody else that sit if you're on, let me know if there's any problems here. But okay, so you can see I have a Silverlight application available. I've already put in the combo box. We have a couple text boxes and a button. And what I'd like to do is right now if we run it, it doesn't do a whole lot because there's no data that's available. So the combo box is empty. Text boxes don't do anything when you select an item and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do is write a really simple kind of Silverlight MVVM 101, if you will, sample. So the first thing I always do is, in a real big app, I'll actually create a separate project. And so I'll right-click and say Add New Project, and I'll add a Silverlight class library and make a view model. I'm going to show you that, a little more robust one, a demo I have in just a sec. For this demo, what I'm going to do, though, is we're going to keep it all kind of self-contained. And I'm just going to add a new folder, mainly because I want the namespace. And I'm going to call it View Models. Now, our goal is, on the server side, I have a very simple, most powerful of all database demo, Northwind. of a customer. And we can certainly add more, but to keep this one really simple, I have a customer object, and I'd like to go grab all the customers, and then as a customer selected from that combo box, I want to show it. And so I also have a service, which is a WCF service, that simply uses the entity framework to do the queries and get the data. That's kind of the first part behind the scenes, and then here's my test pages. Okay, so having shown that, what I'm going to do first is, assuming that your model, your entity is already done, and I only have one at this point for this very simple demo, I'm going to go ahead and add in a new class, and we're going to call this ViewModelBase. Now, again, name doesn't matter. That's what I like to call it, but talk to 5 people and you get 5 different answers here. So we'll call it ViewModelBase. All right, I'm going to strip out a bunch of stuff we're not going to need there. And one of the main namespaces I'm going to need is system.componentModel. And the reason I'm going to need that is ViewModelBase is going to be responsible for every common piece of functionality that any ViewModel class needs to use. So we're going to come in and implement the iNotifyPropertyChanged. And the reason I want to implement that, we'll right-click and implement, is because we need to raise property change for any properties that change in our view model. I don't want to write this code over and over and over times 50 view models. So we're going to go in and just make a real simple method called onPropertyChange to raise it. And this will take, those that have done data binding in Silverlight, this will be old hat to you. But we're going to come in and we'll see if anyone's listening. So if property changed is not null, then let's go ahead and raise the event. And so we'll simply say property changed, and we'll do a new property changed event args, and give it the name of the property. Okay, now this is one of those things that every view model has to have. In fact, every class that you want to bind properly anyway in Silverlight has to have this. So I'm going to define it once. Now, the challenge here, and those with us today that have done this before will know that strings are not real good for compiler stuff. So assuming we have time, I have a nice little technique I add into this to make sure that this is actually a valid property. It's really easy to get typos. I'll try to point that out at the end, assuming we have some time here. But that's kind of my base view model for this really, really simple sample, and then I'll show you some more as we move up here. So that's kind of our 101. Next thing I'm going to do is we have a main page.xaml. That's this guy. And I need to make a view model. So I use a pretty standard convention of name of the XAML file, and then I tack on view model to the end of it. So we'll right-click on view models. We'll add in a class. And I'm going to call this the same name, main page view model. So same exact name as my main page.xaml, and then I always tack on the name view model, and you'll find that most people do that. Again, there's many ways to do it, but that's what most people do. We'll add that in. So you can see that puts us in the proper namespace, and we're going to now inherit from ViewModelBase. Okay, so that takes care of our data binding. So any properties I have in here now, I don't have to worry about iNotifyPropertyChange. I don't have to worry about raising the event. It's all done there for me. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to add in a constructor here, which we'll come back to. Then I also want to add in a couple properties. Now, going back to the form, the goal in life of this view model is to get a collection of customers, and then to track the current customer that's selected for the combo box, and then we're going to ultimately bind that here. All right, and you're going to see that's not too hard to do. So we're going to come in, let's go ahead and close ViewModelBase. We'll come into our main page view model. And the first thing I'm going to do is define the properties. Now, those that are brand new to this, you're used to prop tab, and you can do string. We want, a current customer, which should actually be a customer type. And we want a customer collection, which is going to be observable collection. But you can't do this, of course, in Silverlight. We need to take into account the iNotifyPropertyChanged. So I would highly recommend go out and check out MVVM Lite and download it. Here's the URL at the top, mvvmlight.codeplex.com. And Baran's done a great job on this, and Ron, if you ever hear this, I'm sorry. I know I always say your name wrong, but he's done a great job on this, and it's very, very popular. I remember when he first started this, which is, gosh, it's been a while now, and it's really picked up steam. He's got tutorials in here, and quite a bit of the code I'm going to show later, I've actually, we'll call it borrowed from the source code, because it is an open source project. So the reason I wanted to point this out, number one, it's a great way to go when you're getting started with MVVM and Silverlight or WPF. It works with both. But number two, he has a nice set of code snippets that are in there. So normally, I'd have to type out a field and a property, and I actually have to fill in the get and the set and all that stuff. But with using MVVM Lite, I can just type MVVM INPC tab, and it kind of fills this in for me. So ultimately, I want to track a customer. And if you're wondering where that's coming from, I showed you the service. I've already made a proxy for this WCF service I showed you earlier. So that's where that customer type's coming from, the proxy. And then let me start that over so I can do it the fast way. So we'll do MVVM INPC tab, and we want to track the current customer. That's one of the things I want. You'll notice it automatically fills in the blanks. Much better than the old way of doing it, which is do it by hand. If you like pain, by all means, stick to the do it by hand rule. Okay, the other thing I want is a collection of customers for this first simple demo. So we're going to do MVVM INPC tab, and I want an observable collection of customer. So we'll go ahead and resolve that. And we want to go ahead and name this. So I should have resolved that after, so I could just keep tabbing around. So we'll do observable collection of customer, and we're just going to call this customers. Okay, and that's it for my properties. That's the data that my view needs in order to be able to bind to this and work with it. But the beauty of this is the view you're going to see is going to have absolutely no idea about this data or where it comes from. Okay, the next thing I need is a way to fill the customers with data. So we obviously are going to need a method. We're just going to call it private void get customers. Now, I'm going to do step one of what I showed you earlier here, which was the view model is going to be responsible for not only having its own properties, but also getting the data. Now, in the other demo I'll show you momentarily here, it's a little more robust, and it's going to have the service agent that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. All right, so I already have a proxy that I can call. And so we have a customer's service client here. And I'm just going to give it a real obvious name of proxy. And then we're going to invoke this the standard way. Everything's asynchronous. So we're going to go ahead and say get customers completed. And I'm just going to do a real simple lambda here to handle the callback. All right, that's going to be our callback in just a bit here. And we'll come in and we'll say proxy.get customers async. Now, if you haven't dealt much with lambdas before, such as this, you certainly don't have to go this route. I could come in and certainly have a get customers callback, which would take, what would it take? A get customers completed event arcs, we'll call it E. And then I could handle it there as well. In fact, I might do it both ways here. But ultimately, when this returns, I want to come in and we have a customer's property, which is observable collection. And I want to assign the data that's returned to that. So we're going to say customers equals E dot result. And that will actually let us get to this actual data. Likewise, if you don't like that, if you're not into lambdas at all, then we could just give it our callback, which is get customers callback, and that would do the same thing. So you can pick your poison. If you like lambdas, which I do, you can do that. If you like the callbacks, it's the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and go with this because I know the majority of you have definitely done it this way. Okay, so in the callback again, I'm going to say customers equals E.result, and that assigns my data. And that's really, in this simple demo, that's all I need to do. Now, obviously, when this loads, I want to go ahead and get customers. Now, a big gotcha here that those that are new to this might run into, and that is as you're working with MVVM, your view model, the way I'm going to bind it to the view in just a moment, the designer, either in Expression Blend or in Visual Studio, it will actually, if you do it declaratively, which is the way I'm going to show you, it'll actually invoke the view model. So it actually will call get customers, and get customers tries to go out to the network, and then it fails, and nothing works very good. So what I'd recommend here, I normally do this in a kind of a base, my view model base actually. I have an is in design mode type property, but the easy way to do this is we can come in and say if not designer properties dot is in design tool, and let me resolve that. You can see it's system.component model here. Let me get rid of these guys. Then, if it's not in the design tool, let's go ahead and load the data. Else, I could even give some fake data. I could say new observable collection, and I could even fake some data in. I have an example of that in the other demo I'm going to show you. Okay, which is a little better with technique. But this is a really good little trick, and all we're doing here, again, is if you're brand new to it, is make sure we're not in the designer. All right, if we're not, we're at runtime. Let's go ahead and run this, and then we're off and running. Okay, now that's it for a really simple kind of 10 to 15 minute example of creating a simple view model class. So let me go ahead and try to build here. Make sure we don't have any typos, and we'll keep going. All right, now again, if you came in later, we will be taking questions, but I'm going to hold off those till the end here, so just so we can keep flowing along. So the next thing I want to do is I now have my view model, but what do we do with it? So let me go ahead and jump back into our slides here, and let's talk about that briefly, and then we'll come back to this and do that in code. Okay, so let's talk about binding a view model and exactly how that works and the different options that are available. So we've created a view model class, albeit very simple at this point, but it's ready to go. We now want to use that with our view. Okay, a couple ways to do this. I prefer this first way, which is declarative binding of the view model. And there's many reasons for that, many of which tie into Expression Blend and the new Visual Studio 2010 Designer that is very nice to work with. I'm going to go ahead and demo this in a bit, but I'm going to show you these other ways as well. The second way is you certainly could bind it through code. And then another way, and actually in MVVM Lite, they have something like this built in, is you could use what's called a view model locator to actually dynamically find the view model that the view needs, and then go ahead and hook those two up. And then Caliburn even has a pretty creative way to even do the data binding there. But I'm going to go ahead and show you my preference, and again, I'll try to highlight as many tips on why I like this as possible. But one of the number one reasons is our app has very nested controls. We have user control and combo boxes and data grids and a bunch of nested stuff. And it really simplifies things I've found if we do it the way I'm going to show you here. So, but it's not the only way. Keep that in mind. That's why I said down here, each of these approaches has their own pros and cons. So you need to decide for yourself is the bottom line. All right, so the technique I'm going to show you is this. We already have a view model class, so the first thing we're going to do is reference the namespace, and if it was in a different assembly, we'd reference that as well. So you'll see me do that in a moment. I'm going to give it an alias of view model. That's going to be step one. Step two is I need to define that view model and make it bindable. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to come in and in this timesheet view model, that's that class I showed in the slides earlier, we're just simply going to give it a key, and I always call my key view model. I'm not real creative on names. Then we're going to come down into the grid or whatever your layout root is, and you can even do this at this level, but I like to do it at the layout root level. We're going to bind that to the data context. So we're actually going to make a static resource reference up to our view model. Here's our view model key. That, of course, invokes this class as soon as this view loads at runtime. And it's like doing new timesheet view model, really. And then it's going to assign it to the data context. Now we can go ahead and bind to the different properties of that particular view model. So in this example, the view model happens to have a last name property that we're going to bind to. So once we've assigned it to the data context, we're ready to go, and that's kind of the third step. All right, so let me go ahead and run back, and then we'll finish up this part of it with some other options. Okay, so we have our view model. We've checked if we're in design mode. We have a way to call the WCF service, and we have a way to hook up the data that comes back to our property. And then you'll see where this current customer comes into play in just a bit. So we have two properties. So what I'm going to do is now bind this view model into XAML. So let me go ahead and go into full screen XAML mode. And the first thing I'm going to do is come up, and we need that view model's namespace reference, which is just an alias for the namespace in assembly. So I'm going to call this view models, and I should get IntelliSense now for my view models namespace. There it is right there.
Hello. Okay, guys, sorry, it looks like we've got some kind of audio problem there somewhere. Dan, if you can hear me, can you just pause your presentation a second, please, mate? To all those that are still connected and listening, just bear with me a second, and we're going to try and figure out what's happened. Thanks.
Okay, are you there? It looks like my mic got muted somehow. So thanks for catching that.
No,
let me know.
I think we've just had something hiccup on the server, Dan, because we've just lost like a whole bunch of users as well, and
let me hold off then. I'm going to hold off until you tell me to go ahead, and we'll go that route. Let me go back to the slides in the meantime.
Yeah, no problem, mate.
And then once you think we're good to go, let me know, and we'll give everybody a sec to jump back in.
Okay. Let me just clear this list out. If you can hear your audio now and you put a question on the FAQ regarding your lost audio, can you please remove your question? Anybody who still can't hear any audio or can't hear myself or Dan speaking, please put a question on the FAQ so that we can see what's going on. Right, okay, it looks as though everything's fine now, Dan, so if you want to continue.
Awesome. Yep. All right, thanks. Yeah, and if that happens again, definitely let me know so I don't talk to the wall here.
Well, I think we're probably going to end up with a gap of silence in the recording because I lost my recording thread as well, so...
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. All right.
Tom wants to know if you can back up a couple of slides.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to go back. I think, did the audio go out right as I started the demo here?
Yeah, everything went.
Okay. So let me, hopefully everybody can hear me now, and let me go ahead and sort of rehearse what I was talking about, and apparently I was talking to the dog. So the first thing I was talking about, we already went through in the slides. You have to reference the namespace and assembly of your view model class. And so the view model is in my same project, so I don't need to worry about the assembly. All I did, if you didn't catch it, was I went in, did XML-NS, we did view models, equals, and then Visual Studio is nice enough to give me IntelliSense for this view models namespace that we made earlier, and that gets us to this folder here, in essence. The second thing I did was we want to go ahead and use that view model, so we're going to take the alias for the namespace, and you'll notice that Visual Studio pops up main page view model. And then we give it a key, which you saw earlier. And I'm just going to call that view model. That's what I always call it every time. And if you didn't hear me earlier, I'm not real creative on names. I like to name it what it is, and it's my view model, so that's what I'm calling it. The data context. Now we want to bind the view model instance to the data context so that we can bind these controls to the properties. So I'm going to come in and add data context, go to our binding, and the source of the binding is going to be a static resource, and it's going to point to that view model key. Notice it just lit up. If you're wondering, like my little pencil, I'm using ReSharper here, which is XAML aware, which is pretty nice. Okay, so that's it for hooking up to the data context. Now, this sometimes shows up and sometimes doesn't, so I might have to show you both ways here, but let me show you a nice trick you can do sometimes. When you're in the designer, now that I've hooked it up declaratively, I usually go in and do a build for good measure to make sure everything's working. And then we can come in and use some of the new designer features, or you can do this in Blend for sure. But I can come like into the item source, and let's see if it picks up my binding. It did. Excellent. Now, occasionally I've had it where for some reason this source won't show up as your main page view model or whatever your view model is. And usually what you have to do is rebuild if it doesn't show up, and you do it declaratively like I just did. And then if that doesn't work, I usually close Visual Studio and reopen, and it seems to always work that way. But it looks like it worked good. So we want to bind the item source to our customer's observable collection. Now, that just took care automatically of doing that binding. So we'll go ahead and go off that. You can see customers now shows in our item source here. Now, the second thing I want to do is when they select an item, I want to associate the item they selected with the current customer property of the view model. That's easy to do because, of course, the combo box has a selected item that we can get to, and we can bind that with a two-way binding. So I'm going to go to selected item, and we're going to come in and say apply data binding to current customer, and I want to make sure that in my options here it's a two-way binding, and you can see it is. So if you haven't used this before, it's one of the nice new features in Visual Studio. We've been able to do this in Blend for quite some time, but you know, if you want to do it without leaving Visual Studio or you don't have access to Blend, it's a pretty good way to go. Okay, now if we go back to the XAML, that now has automatically allowed me to do the binding here. It should have anyway. There we go. There's our item source, and there's our selected item. And so we're now binding the customers of the view model to the item source, and we're binding the current customer to the selected item with a two-way, so that if current customer changes in the combo box, it updates the property. Now, why do I want to do that? Well, I want to bind each text box to the current customer property. Now, some of you that have been doing this a long time might just say, well, why not just use element-to-element binding and bind the text box up to the combo box's selected item? And I could do that. That would certainly be valid. But I like to drive everything through the view model. I call it my data-centric approach. Again, there's not one right way to do it. If you prefer element-to-element binding, by all means, go ahead and go with it. But what I'm going to do now, let's go back to Design View, come down to our text boxes, and we're going to come to the text property. We don't have anything, so we're going to go ahead and try to apply a data binding. We want to bind to current customer and contact name. Right there, contact name. On this one, we want to do the same thing. I'm going to apply a data binding to current customer, and we want title, contact title, I guess it is. And then finally, we want to get the city. So you can see how easy that is without having to type the bindings if you haven't used this new way. And city. Okay, so again, going back to the XAML, just as I showed you earlier, this should have automatically done the bindings. There they are. There's my different text properties, all bound up nicely for me without having to do any binding. Automatically did two-way for me, which is nice. And I didn't have to type, any of my bindings. So now I'm binding to the view model's current customer contact name. And if you remember, all the view model had was two properties. We had customers, and we had current customer. So when current customer changes, by virtue of the combo box changing, that'll automatically update the title, contact name, and all that stuff down here. Okay, so we should be pretty much all hooked up now. So when the view model gets invoked, we get our customers, we fill our customer's property, and then from there, we let the bindings drive everything through our view model. So let me go ahead and do a sanity check here for build. And let me make sure I fired this guy up earlier, but let's make sure the service is running here. It should automatically do it, and let's go ahead and see what we can get for our bindings. So it might take a sec to JIT here on the back end. Let's see. All right, let's wait, and we'll pray here that customers show up in a bit. There we go. Okay, so let me rerun that, because after the very first time the service runs, it should be pretty fast. Okay, so there's my customers. You can see that was all bound. We can select a customer. That automatically updates the different items down here because we're now binding to the view model's current customer. Now, the beauty of this, I call this a data-centric approach. If we come down to the text box, unless Visual Studio added it, yeah, there is absolutely no name or ID on my text box controls. I don't need it. If you're coming from an ASP.NET background, you're used to always having to go through the controls to actually work with your data. Well, I have a post about this particular subject because when I first learned Silverlight, I did come from very much ASP.NET background. And so this whole kind of way we're doing this data binding was sort of kind of alien to me several years back. And as a result, I tried to do everything the old way, which was I named all my controls, I went through my controls to get the data, and that's how I kind of drove things. Well, I'm going to tell you now, that way works. Definitely not the way you want to go. As soon as you get into more complex scenarios with data grids and nested controls, that breaks down really fast, that approach. This way works every time. Doesn't matter how nested your controls are, you'll still be able to get to the data. So it's pretty cool. So anyway, that would be an example of what we just looked at in the slides. We've now created a view model class. We've now done the three-step self-help process, which is define the alias, add a key, and then bind that key to our data context. That's not the only way, though. So let me go ahead and jump back. And let's go back to the slides, and we'll talk about a couple other things before we go into a few other wrap-up topics here. Okay, so there's more options than what I just showed you. Some of you might just want to do this. You might actually, when the XAML file loads, the code behind, code beside, whatever we call it nowadays, you might actually want to go in and do this through code. And so you go in and actually create a new instance of your view model, and then you assign it to the layout roots data context. That's certainly valid as well. Another technique you can do, and I combo approach this sometimes, which I'm going to show you that in just a sec, is I might actually need to get to the view model. The view model should know about the view. But the view model, or the view, definitely, the screen definitely knows about the view model because that's what it's binding to after all. So there may be times where it's just easier to get access to the view model and then call a method on it. Now, I try to avoid this, but I'm not a purist here. I'm a let's get it done productively and keep the client happy on the budget approach. If you're a purist, you probably won't like what I'm going to show you in just a bit, but I do want to mention it. I was just working with Intel last week, and this came up in a discussion on a way somebody was doing something, and I'm not opposed to it, but I'll show you what I mean in a sec. So what we're doing here is I declaratively bound my view model, and I want to get to that in the code behind or code beside. So we're going to get to the views resources, grab the key, cast it the appropriate type, and now I have access to that through a property up here called view model. Now, why do that? Now, I'm going to recommend, number one, against doing this, but I'm going to show you that it is valid and it certainly works. So let me come back to here and show you an example. So we have a button. Now, we're going to end talking about something called commanding as I get a little further here. Oop, I didn't share this right. Hold on, sorry. Okay, hopefully you can see it now. So we have a button here, and I'm going to go ahead and double-click it like kind of you would when you start Silverlight apps from scratch, not knowing any better. And let's say that this is the way I want to do it. I don't know about commanding, but I still want to talk to the view model and do something. So let's just go add kind of a fictitious method here. and we'll call it save customer. And this may actually allow a customer object to be passed in, and then we would call back to the service and work with this customer. Well, I'm going to talk about commanding in a bit and kind of what I consider the best practice and what most people consider best practice for communicating between the view, that button, and this view model. That's commanding. But there is another technique you can do that is more simple for sure, but I don't know that it's my favorite approach, but I'm going to show you anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and create a property up here. I'm going to type it as main page view model. Let's resolve that. And then I'll try to resolve it. We'll call that view model. Let me fix the type. And then what I'm going to do is when this loads here, after things are initialized, I could say view model equals, and we're going to do it, well, I can just do an as here. We'll say resources, go get me that key I defined earlier as a main page view model. Now I store that up in the view model. So the easiest way when they click a button to communicate with a view model is just do this. Now again, I'm not saying this is the way I prefer to do it because it's not, but I just want to show you that it is okay. It does work. And now we can just call save customer. In fact, I don't even need to pass the customer now. Let's go back to our view model. I don't need this guy here because I already have current customer. I already know what the current customer is from the property we defined earlier, and that gets updated when they select the combo box. So no need to pass it in. Now we could, call WCF or RIA services service to save customer right here. And I'll have some examples of that coming up here. But that is kind of what I'm going to call the poor man's way of communicating between a view model and a view when you declaratively define the view model like I did up top here, which I prefer to do it this way. I do like the declarative approach. Sometimes I might look this up dynamically using a different technique called a view model locator, but regardless, I like this approach right here of how I actually associate those two. For those of you that are new to this, this is probably the easiest way when they click the button to actually forward that call up to the view model to process that data. Not my recommended approach, though. Okay, and that gets us into a nice segue here, which is going to be commanding. So let me go ahead and go back. Okay, so what I just did there is fake commanding. It's definitely not commanding. And what's going on is when they click the button, we actually handled it. We added a middleman into the process. Now, the problem is that's kind of unnecessary code. I really don't want to add a middleman into all this. Instead, what I'd like to do is just route this directly over. So here's how it works. I have a view model. When they click the button or do any event, I actually want to call, instead of the code behind, I want to call the view model. So I want to do this. Now we call this process commanding. And this is, for instance, when an event is triggered here, we want to go ahead and route that event along and just totally ignore the code behind and instead invoke a method on our view model. Now, this is somewhat built into Silverlight 4. In Silverlight 3, you'd have to hack in some things. It is possible. We were doing it in Silverlight 3. But Silverlight 4, it's much easier, but only with button base. Now, for our app that we're working on, we have a whole bunch of other things besides just buttons that can trigger events. We have images they can click on a toolbar. We have rectangles. There's all kinds of stuff. So we have to actually not only track the click, but we also track the mouse left button down or mouse left button up, as an example. So the way commanding works out of the box is Microsoft has built in, and this has been in there for a while, but it wasn't really implemented, this iCommand interface, which I'll show you in just a bit. And any object, or any control, I should say, that it inherits from button base, and that includes these guys, button, hyperlink button, and so on and so forth here. These controls, as a result of inheriting from button base, get two new properties, command and command parameter. Now, command parameter I rarely need because I take this data-centric approach to doing my views and my view models so that my view model always knows what data is in the view, because there's two-way bindings hooked up and all that good stuff. The command, though, I use all the time. And what the command allows you to do is, in essence, think of that, if you're brand new to this, as instead of calling it, click equals something, we could say command equals, and we can actually bind this into the view model. So you guys are all used to, in ASP.NET or Windows Forms or WPF, you double-click the button, and it makes the event handler. What we're doing with commanding is the same thing, in essence, is that instead of defining a click, I'm going to define a command which routes that click back into the view model. So I'll show you how that works in just a sec here. All right. What if you're not using buttons? Well, there's a nice little trick you can do with the Blend SDK, and we'll talk about some behaviors in just a sec here. So anyway, this command, this iCommand interface, has three main members. Okay, it determines, can that command execute? So if you're on a button, and that button is supposed to be clicked after they fill out the text boxes, wouldn't it be nice if the button was just grayed out until they've met your rules? You didn't even worry about it. Just once they meet the rules, it gets enabled. Well, in the old days, with other frameworks, we have to write all the code to do that in general. With Silverlight and WPF and MVVM and commanding, we don't. It's actually kind of a cool built-in feature. And again, I'll show you this in just a bit here. So can the button execute? Can the command execute and actually trigger that method on the view model? When it does execute, where does it go? Okay, that's execute. And then when something executes, or when can executes changes, I should say, there's a can execute change, and that's what handles enabling or disabling the button, the radio button, or the checkbox, or whatever it is. Okay. Now, this next part is what you do to make commanding work. And if you're brand new to this, this is one of those things I highly recommend. Just take the time. I'm going to explain it here in about 5 minutes. But having been through this, the first time I heard about commanding, I'll have to be honest, it didn't totally click. And I didn't really see why I needed it. I looked at what I showed you guys earlier with the little kind of poor man's hack I showed you and said, why not just do that? That seems easier. It is, but as you get into big apps, you definitely just have to trust me. You want to go this route. It ends up working out for the better. It's more maintainable, more testable, and all those good things. So here's how it works. You have a button. That button now has a command property in Silverlight 4, and we're going to bind that to a property of the view model. Now, when we bound the combo box before, we bound to customers, which was our property, and that was just the standard, observable collection of customer. In this example, we're actually going to bind to a special type of property called a relay command. Now, I already pulled up the MVVM Lite toolkit. That's where I got relay command from, and then I've hacked it a little bit, but this is just a simple class that's in the MVVM Lite that you can use to handle this commanding. So it's just something you include in your Silverlight project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bind that command down to this property in my view model. Now, that doesn't do much. This is literally what you'd see for the property in the view model. And again, I'll pull up a sample of this in just a sec. You just have a get and a private set, and that's it. That's all this relay command does. So that doesn't do us much good because, in essence, what a relay command does is when you bind a property of a view model to a command of a button, you actually want to route that, because there's a click event. You want to route that to a method. So the way we do that in my view model, I always put in this wire commands. And what wire commands does is it hooks up my property in my view model, that's a relay command, to the method that should be invoked when the button command is triggered. So the button command is triggered, that's bound to the property. The property is then hooked up to a callback method called update person. Now, some of you that are, again, brand new to this, you might like the kind of poor man's hack I showed you earlier, because this is a little more involved. I can promise you once you do it a little while, though, it's awesome. It works very well. So the command is bound to this, and then when that is actually invoked, when this property is invoked, because it's a relay command, this little method down here called update person is actually going to be called. And that's how commanding works. And so let me show you a real simple example, and then we'll get back and talk about some kind of non-standard things you'll run into. Let me share the desktop again. Okay, so I kind of did the, the bad way, which certainly works. But it's pretty easy to wire this up to the view model. So I'm going to go back into the XAML. We're going to clear out the click event so that this will compile. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a class I have here locally, which is from MVVM Lite, which is a relay command. And I'm going to show you the basics. Then I have a more robust project we're going to wrap up with that also shows commanding plus the final topic, which is messaging. So let me go to my desktop, and I should have a relay command up there somewhere. Okay, so here's my relay command. I'm going to go ahead and just call this MVVM demo for my namespace .commanding. And again, this just implements iCommand. I'm not going to walk you through the code. There's not that much here, but it has those three things. It has the can execute, it has the execute in here, and then it has the event right here. So there's the execute, and there's the event when the can execute changes. So what I'm going to do is come back to the view model, and because this is called Save Customer, I'm going to go ahead and make a new property. I'm going to call it relay command for the type. Let's go ahead and resolve that. And we'll call it save customer command. Now from here, all I want is a get and a private set. That's it. I want them to be able to get the command to bind to it, and that's about all I want to do. Okay, that's useless on its own. So what I normally do here is if we're not in the designer, which we already showed the nice little is in design tool trick, I always make something called wire commands right in the constructor. So we'll go ahead and generate a stub for that guy. And all you do here is you need to bind this guy to the method, which is, I think we called it save customer here. That should be called when the command is invoked. So I now have my property right below. I now need to say save customer command equals new relay command that points to save customer. And that's it. That's all you do. So the command is now going to be bound to the button. When the button's clicked, because that's hooked up to this, that will now invoke my method. And that is commanding in a nutshell. So let's go back to the XAML here. And now we can come in. Let me go ahead and build and make sure it picks all this up. Okay, so now I can come in and let's just wrap this down so we can see it. And we're going to say command equals, and now we're going to do a binding, but we want to bind to the appropriate property, which was save, I think, customer command, if I'm thinking right here. And that's how you bind that property to the command of my button. Let's make sure I name that right. Yep, save customer command, there it is. We know that now routes to the save customer, and save customer doesn't do much, but let's see if I can get it to call here. So let's just do a string foo. We'll set a breakpoint there, and let's give it a shot, and then we're going to jump in to finish things up today, a little more robust demo I keep promising here. Okay, so there's the browser. We can see our data. I'm now going to pick my object. We could certainly change it to new contact, but notice it's grayed out. Okay, and that's because right now the is enabled of my execute, the can execute is false, and that's kind of the default in the way I've tweaked it here. So I'm going to go ahead, and what we would normally do is if there's a current customer, so we could come into the property on current customer, we could say, if value does not equal null, if we do have a customer that's loaded, then let's go ahead and we could come into our save person command and set the is enabled to true. And what that'll do is if there is no current customer, it should be grayed out. If there is a current customer to be edited, we want them to be able to click that button. And so we're simply going to tell it, yeah, go ahead, and once we have a customer, let's enable it. Now, there's a lot more you'd probably do here. You might actually check the current customer first name actually has a valid value, before you enable it if it's a required field. But for this simple demo, we'll call it good. So let's go ahead and try it again. All right, so you can see it's grayed out. Now, hopefully, when I select something, there we go. Now it's grayed in, whatever you want to call it, it's enabled, and we're ready to go. Let's go ahead and we'll just say new contact name. We'll hit submit. That just called my saved customer, and now I could get to, down in the immediate window, we could get to something like current customer if we wanted, and we could actually work with that current customer to say get the what was it, contact name, I believe it was, and there we go. We have new contact name shows up, and we're ready to go. Now we can call the WCF service, and we're off and running. So that's an example of doing commanding in Silverlight. Now to wrap up, I have a little more, not super involved demo, but I'll post this on my blog, which if you came in late, I already showed the URL. I'll show it again here in a bit. Let me open up a little more robust demo here. This is one I gave at Tech Ed that just has a few more features to it. So let's come into MVVM demo, open up the solution. And this one's a little more robust in that it has a few more projects. It uses the service agent. I talked at the beginning of the talk a little about that, and that just breaks out my calls to my services in a separate client-side class I call a service agent. But other than that, I have some custom controls in here if you're interested, like an autocomplete box, autocomplete combo box, I should say. Here's my Silverlight project. There's my service agent that communicates with the server from Silverlight. Here's my view models in a separate project. And then I have my services back here on the back end, which is just, in this case, a WCF service, but it could be a RIA services just as easily. So let me go ahead and show a few things with commanding in here that you'll quickly run into on a real app. Most of the demos you see out there, they look good up on stage, and then you get to real life and you go, crap, that doesn't work for what I got to do. So one of those would be, what happens when you don't have buttons? How are you going to route those to the view model using commanding? So this little app is pretty simple, but what it does is it calls back to a WCF service, gets some data, loads it into a custom control. This is one we built for our clients. They wanted an autocomplete combo box where you can type the name or you can just select it. So that'll be in the sample if you need it. But let's say we select Tina Taft here. That now loads this. Those are now bound to the current customer up here. And then if I click submit, this will call the view model using commanding. That calls back to the service. The service then calls the view model, lets it know if it worked or not. And then if it did work, we need to notify the interface somehow that it did. And I show a little animation. I don't know how well this will show over the live meeting here, but it pops down a little animation. Now, if they put in something invalid, such as an invalid age of 0, then we get an error on the back end, and this one doesn't do client-side validation, so the service returns that, hey, something's wrong, and we just do a simple animation there. Okay, the other thing it does that ties into commanding, and the last part that's in the slides here that I want to show you, is if you hit add, this is not a button, and the image is obviously not a button. Now, you certainly could make this into a button using control templates, but I thought that was a little bit overkill. So when you hit add, this also uses commanding to allow them to add in a new customer. So we could do Dan Wahlin. I wish I was about 25, and I live in Arizona. And now we can go ahead and submit that. And you'll notice if I hit down, Dan Wahlin now shows up, and we're good to go. Or I could remove Dan Wahlin out, and this would use commanding. Now, the challenge there, and you'll see it's gone, the challenge there is that that particular item, these guys down here, are just stack panels. They're not doing anything at all except for wrapping an image control and a text block. Well, those two controls, image stack, or three controls, image, stack panel, and text blocks, they don't have a command property because it's not button-based. So what do? Well, let me go back to the slides and show you the fundamentals, and then we'll wrap up with the demo here. Okay, so here is what's going on with the demo I just showed you. We have an example here of a stack panel, we have an image, and we have a text block. That's that add thing you just saw. Well, what I want to do is when they click the stack panel, I want to use commanding to bind that stack panel somehow to a property, and then that property invokes a method in the view model class. Well, it's not that hard to do, but you got to know a little trick. If you have Expression Blend installed, you'll have this DLL on your system. If you don't, go download the Expression Blend SDK, the Software Developer Kit, which is free. And it has this DLL in it, and you need to reference it in your Silverlight project. And so I gave it a reference name, an alias, kind of like we did with view models earlier, of System Windows Interactivity is the namespace there. And, well, yeah, that is the namespace. And it is an alias of I in this example. And then it's a little bit, a little verbose. I would hope they'll someday shorten this. I know they're working on it. But you do the following. You say, hey, I have some triggers. When the mouse left button up is triggered on whatever control is the parent, which is the stack panel, then I would like to invoke a command which is bound to a property of the view model called addPerson command. And so you can see we have this invoke command action that binds it just like we did before with the button. This is the magic, though. Okay, whereas commanding, let me go back. Whereas this guy requires you to use a button to be able to get to the command property, if you want to do this with non-button controls, just use this System Windows Interactivity DLL. Pretty much cut and paste the code you see here and just change this guy and maybe change the event. But this works with any event that fires. And now you're not locked down to just buttons. Because, like I mentioned, in our kind of more, well, it's definitely real-life app that our big one we're building right now for a client, I'd say maybe 20% of the controls used are buttons. Most of them, when they click on things, it's different menus that are non-buttons. And so it's kind of in the old days, we'd use that poor man's hack. You know, we'd handle the mouse left button down in the code behind. Then we'd route that up to the view model. But still, that, you know, adds that middleman code. This gets rid of the middleman. It allows you to get directly, handle any event, plus do commanding. And it's really easy to do. So we go ahead and I'm going to show you that, but I'm going to wrap up with commanding here, or messaging, and then I'm going to go back to that other sample app and show you how this little piece ties in to that. So let's go ahead and go to messaging. Let's talk about that, and then we'll wrap up here, take any questions we might have. All right, so the final topic is messaging, and this is how it works. You might have the need that you might have, let's say, 4 user controls in one screen. Each user control might have its own view model. That's very real life. Each user control might have like a little mini-me view model. So what we're going to do is we want to be able to communicate maybe between view models, or in the demo I just ran you, when the view model got notified that the update to the customer worked or didn't work either. You know, I kind of slid down that little green thing, or you saw a little red thing slide down. Well, how do you communicate from the view model, which knows about the status of the operation, back to the view? Well, that's another way you can use messaging, is from view model to view. So all we're talking about is communication between 2 objects that might not know about each other at all. Now, in the .NET Framework in general, this is pretty easy, right? You just do events, and then you can subscribe to an event queue, and you can take care of it. And that's what I put into the demo, but I'm going to talk about some other ways you can do it. With Prism, there's an option, and then with MVVM Lite, there's an option. Caliburn has an option, these different frameworks I mentioned earlier. So that's what messaging is, though. We just want to talk between 2, maybe view model classes, or maybe backwards between the view model and the view, because the view model, again, it should not know anything about the view, at least in my opinion. That means it should know about animations, shouldn't know about transforms, shouldn't know about pop-up boxes. That's all view stuff. All right. So there's different options for doing this. I'm going to show you the way I do it, and I'll talk about the pros and cons. And then I actually recommend that you look at MVVM Lite's way. I happen to think that's a really nice way to go. When we started our project, that wasn't out yet. Prism has a few dependencies if you choose the event aggregator that we didn't want in our app. And then, so we ended up doing this way up here, which I'll get into. But You can either kind of roll your own, which is what we did, very, very simple to do. I would recommend you look at this, though, for one specific reason I'll mention in just a bit here. Or you might want to also look at Prism. If you're already using Prism, I would definitely go with this. Okay, this is an example of MVVM Lite, some code right on the website that Laurent put up. And if you ever wanted to have a view model, we'll call it view model A, and it needs to subscribe to an event that occurs. And then view model B raises the event. Well, here's how you do it. You simply register for, in this case, a string event. And then when that gets called, you're going to call this do something and handle the string. That's how you register or subscribe. To raise the event, you simply say messenger default send, and then because it's a string type of registration, we're going to go ahead and raise a string property. Now, this is very much simplified. You can do filters and all kinds of cool stuff with this. But you can see how simple it is to register for an event that some other object might send and subscribe or send to that event, notify the event. All right, so let me go ahead and show an example, and then we'll wrap up and take some questions here. Okay, so in the code that's going to pull up here shortly, hopefully. All right, I have a little class I put in here called People Event Bus. Now, this is the roll your own approach, has its own set of pros and cons, works very well, but you've got to be aware of one thing. So what this does is I created a static class called People Event Bus. This is the thing that all the objects that need to talk to each other go through. It's think of it as the central station, if you will, for events. Now, this one only has one particular event called Operation Completed. Now, this is the one that you saw earlier, though, that fired to pop down that green or the red slide down. Hopefully you can see that. I'm not sure if it came through very good, but when the operation completes from the service and the view model notifies the view to trigger the animation. So we just have a public way to raise the event, and then we have a way to subscribe to the event. Very simple. So the view model, when it gets notified that something happened, it'll raise the event. So let's come down to, update person. So I call out to a service agent class. This is responsible for actually calling the WCF service. This is the thing I talked about at the beginning of the presentation where I like to break out my calls and not have all that in the view model. So it has a method called call service. This one, if you're doing a lot of WCF, this works out pretty well. That'll be in the sample. Here's my lambda for my callback. And then when it comes back, I simply go through the event bus to raise an event, which you just saw. And I pass it a operation completed event arc that I created. And I give it the result that I got back from the WCF service. So I'm literally just passing through, did it work or did it not, up into this event that it gets raised. And that just calls this guy. Very simple. So we just raised the event. Now, the thing that slides down is the main page view model. You'll notice when it loads, it subscribes to the event and attaches to it. Now, what that does is that redirects it down to this method, which is my callback. And that simply determines the status, and then it just plays, there's a media element. You guys won't be able to hear it, but there's a sound it plays. And then it also starts a storyboard that simply slides down the animation. Okay, so messaging is actually what's being used here. When I select a customer, make some fake edits to it, and then hit submit, that just raised the event from the view model. The main page XAML got it, and then triggered the animation. And then, like I showed you earlier, if you put in some bogus data, now it knows that it was bad, and it showed that animation. So, but the good news is here, the view model knew nothing about the service, or even, in this case, much about the view model. It just knew it got an event raised, and it subscribed to it to handle that animation that shows in the application. Now, this approach is absolutely fine because when they close the browser, it closes mainpage.xaml, which is going to clean up everything. Okay, here's the downside of this homegrown approach. And this is why I'd probably jump right to MVVM Lite and use the messenger were I to do our whole app from scratch. And here's why. Let's say that I had a user control, such as this customer's grid, and it attaches to events, just like I showed you. But then it goes out of scope. Okay, so in other words, I have a screen that loads in maybe 4 different user controls, and those user controls then dynamically get loaded and dynamically get removed. The problem with this approach is you have to be careful to detach the event. Otherwise, you could get a memory leak. Now, that's not a big deal for our app. Every user control in ours implements iDisposable. And before we remove anything, we always call dispose. And that cleans up all the event attachments. But it is still something I have to manage. Not overly fun, to be real honest with you. And so that's why I showed you in the slides. We're going to wrap up with those here. The MVVM Lite approach, which is the messenger, and that's the one I would look at first if you're new to this. I'm sure some of you in the audience here are already doing Prism or something. Prism would be another option. Let me go back to the options here. All right, so there's even more than this. Caliburn has options as well, but this is the main options out there, but this is the messenger I was referring to that I would recommend. Okay, so what we're going to do now, that is a wrap on the content. I do want to show you real quick. I promised I could show that behavior for commanding with stack panel and things. So let me show you that, and then we'll take any questions, and I'll give you the link to where you can get the code for this if you want the demos. Okay. So I'm going to go into, let's see, home.xaml has the stack panel and the images with the add and remove customers I showed you. And at the very top, here's where I referenced that System Windows Interactivity namespace and assembly. So again, that comes with the Blend SDK. It's not part of Silverlight out of the box. So you're either going to have to get Blend, or if you can't get Blend, which I'd recommend you do if you're going to be doing much Silverlight, but if you can't, download just search for Expression Blend SDK, and it's in there when you install it. That's the first thing. Then here's my stack panel. That's the one that when they click on it, or actually it's right here. That's the one that when they click on it, when the mouse left button up fires, I'd like to invoke a command, which is add person. Or I have another example of a stack panel where I want to do it for the remove person. Again, it's the same thing. Here's the button way of doing it up top. There's my command on my button, which calls that property, which ultimately relays it to the the update person. These do exactly the same thing. It's just more verbose, but we're still binding to a view model property. Same exact procedures, just a little more involved. Hopefully they'll make that a little more flat in the future. So that's kind of the final thing I wanted to show that I promised I'd show you there. The other thing I talked about, I'm not going to go into it much since we're out of time here, is the service agent. If you're interested in how to break that out, I'm also using a little MEF in this example, Managed Extensibility Framework, so that you guys can see that too if you wanted for dynamically importing and doing dependency injection. So pretty cool stuff you can do there as well. So with that, let me go back. Let me pop up, for those that are going to take off, let me pop up where the demo code is, and we'll wrap up. So just a sec here. All right, let me show it. Okay, so I will get this up within the next 30 minutes or so. I haven't posted it officially because those of you that showed up, I wanted you to see it before everyone else gets it. And let me see, I just got a text from Peter. Okay, cool. And we can go a little over, it sounds like, if we have some other questions. So that's great because I have some time as well. So this is where you can actually get the code. Again, that'll be up, give me about, I don't know, 30 minutes or an hour or so. And if you want all the demos I've shown plus the slides, you'll be able to get it from there. Again, if you're on Twitter, by all means, anything that comes in the next hour or so, I'll follow you back because I'll know it came from this presentation. Hopefully you're not selling, something you shouldn't be selling. And then finally, here's where you can get a hold of me. If as a quick sales pitch on the end, I don't like to do it at the beginning, but since you hung around, if you are interested in training on .NET and stuff or consulting, definitely get a hold of me. We'll actually fly to you. So we do a lot of on-site training opportunities there. And that's it. So let me go ahead to the Q&A window, and let's see if we have anything come in. And I haven't seen much so far, so Peter, if I miss anything, here we go.
No problem. We've got 9 questions there. They've been stacking up while you've been discussing stuff.
Good, good. Okay, so first question. Rico asked, anyone know of where to get good documentation on MVVM lights? You know, the first site, I'll let anybody else, if you want to chat, you can, but the first site I'd go to, I'm going to switch back. Well, no, I'll just mention it. The first site I would go to is the mvvmlight.codeplex.com, because Laurent has some stuff up there. Other than that, I don't know that there's one main site other than his to go to, other than just searching on Google and doing blog posts. So I don't have a whole lot more to give you on that one, per se. All right. Let's go ahead. I keep kicking the wrong window here. Okay, Teresa asks, what do you do if you want to use parts of 2 view models in a view? Yeah, so what you can do there is, keep in mind, it's up to you on what data context to bind to. And so what I mean by that is, in the demo I did, I bound to the layout route, but you don't have to. I could, like down at a stack panel or data grid or some container control level, I could actually do the same thing. So I could literally define 2 view models, if you're doing it declaratively, up in my resources, and then bind using the same techniques you saw me do earlier. It's just that the data context would bind to say, you might have view model as a key and maybe customer's view model or something as a key. So your data context on your, we'll call it the nested view model, it would just bind to the data context would bind to the different key in your resource, or you could do that through code, of course. So that's kind of what I would do there. Not a problem if you did have multiple view models. Let me check that one off there. Okay, let's see, Joel, there are many events on a button. Why does command go says the click? Is that the default? Can this be changed? Yeah, click is the default. Great question. And that's just how it works. That's why it is only available on the button click event. And so that's just kind of how it works, I guess, is the answer there. If you want to change it, like if you wanted to, for some reason, a mouse over on a button or on a button, I really can't think of a lot of other things you might want, but you might have one. Then you'd probably have to resort to what I showed you with the System Windows Interactivity DLL and do the invoke command behavior or invoke command action. But yeah, button is the default. Okay, let's see. Srinivas asked, can everything be showed here? Commanding binding also work with, and just a sec, I had a chat window come up. Okay, with a view model. So in MVC, ASP.NET MVC, I absolutely use view models because my controller will create the view model and then I'll bind it. Now, I'm not going to go too much into that right now, but yes, you can use view models. The binding, of course, is totally different, though. For ASP.NET, I would check out the MVP pattern that Microsoft actually has, I believe, some tech previews of that out there. They've done some pretty cool stuff there. And yes, you could use view models there as well. Number 2, why would you have the service reference in the web project? Why not in the view model? Well, that's because my first demo, that's what it did. It was simple. My second one is not in the service reference is either going to be at your Silverlight or it's going to be, I like to break it out into my service agent project. So you'll be able to see that in the project. How do you do error handling, present error messages? Check out, there's 2 errors. And let me see, am I able to chat to everyone? Yeah.
Yes, you are, Dan. If you look at the Manage panel on questions and answers, you'll see the bottom box has a reply to all and a reply privately. Just type in the box. If you hit reply to all once you finish typing,
cool. I got it. Thank you. Yeah, those are grayed out. Very good. Thank you, sir. Yeah, so you can do the following. There's I data error info and I notify data error info. And I haven't posted about this one yet, but I did put the sample code. If you're interested in that, I just did a blog post. It's up on my blog already on iData error info like 2 weeks ago. If you download that code, it also shows how to use this interface. Oh, I got to reply to all. There we go. And it basically shows you that. So, okay, Prasad asks, please show the URL for the TechEd demo code. Okay, that's I did, so I think we're good there. That's up. What should be shown on the slides. I'll go ahead and post it.
I was going to say, you've also got the whiteboard there as well, Dan, don't forget. If you look at the bottom of your view window where you've got your contact info up, there's a little pen with a yellow, no, sorry, there's a
Oh, yeah, I see it. Okay.
drawing tool down there. If you click that, it'll switch to whiteboard mode so you can scribble on the screen.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Let me see this guy here. So, well, this highlights it now, so I think we're good. But, yeah, go to this URL right there. And that will that'll get you the actual code from the TechEd talk, which is the talk I gave today, pretty much. That's different talk, but same code. Okay, keeping on going here. What are the benefits of using commands, especially that blend behavior thing I showed, over regular code behind event handlers? Isn't that overkill? So the benefit is, if you do the poor man's way, it still works. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you handle all the code in the code behind for like a click event, now you just kind of broke your separation of concerns. It's going to be really hard to test comparing to putting that in the view model. If you put it in the view model, now you can just test against a real class. It's just a class. There's no XAML involved. There's no user interface. It's good for unit testing. If you're doing, user experience type testing or functional testing, then yeah, you're going to have to test the interface, but that's a whole different ball of wax. So the answer is that it provides for better testing. I think it simplifies maintenance as well. I don't believe the code behind should have no code, because if you're going to trigger animations or show pop-up messages and stuff like that, that's what I think should go there in the code behind. But for things like commanding, that breaks the having to have the middleman. Now, having said that, if you like the first approach I showed, I call it the poor man's commanding. By all means, go with that if you liked it. It works fine. It's just not the recommended approach if you can use commanding. That's what I used to do in Silverlight 3 sometimes, though, before we had it. So, okay, next up. I read your blog post about simplifying the service agent calls by using a generic type. Very cool, but I had a question. Does iService agent just contain call service now? Yeah, Brian, pretty much. It has a few other things in my real app, in our, I should say, real app, but yeah, pretty much. The service agent that you'll see in the demo code also has that call service of T in it, which you read in the blog post a long time ago. And yeah, I don't need all that wrapper code anymore. I estimate I've eliminated probably 500 lines of code by doing it that way. And for those that are interested, just go, if you're kind of going, what the heck's he talking about? Download the sample code and check out the service agent class. You'll see a call service generic method that I use. So I show how to do it the old-fashioned way, which is use the old async calls. And then I show how to do it without having to write a bunch of wrapper code in the service agent. So yeah, you're right on, Brian. Okay, let's see here. Okay, can you show the method you used? Oh, yeah, I didn't show that. Yeah, Brian, I'll probably say your last name wrong, Brian. Brian Bem asked, can I show how to check the string property? Yeah, I mentioned that and kind of spaced actually showing it. So I mentioned earlier, there's some pretty clever ways I've seen people do this. I'll have to admit, I like this way. I didn't actually invent it. I think I heard, a lot of you probably heard of Josh Smith. I think I first heard about it from his post, and then he pointed to someone else's post. But hopefully you can see my desktop now. Let me go ahead and open up my view model, my base view model. This is something I put in every base. Okay, so what I have is, here's where I raise the event. But the danger here is if they type a property, invalid, like as an example, it's really easy for fat finger. It's supposed to be customers, but you type customer, but it's supposed to be that. Well, what I do is I have this check property exists. Now, some people I've seen, they use lambdas here. To be honest, I think it's extreme overkill, and here's why. I have this little conditional debug. This only runs if I'm in debug mode. As soon as I switch this over to release mode, this gets compiled out, so there's absolutely no performance impact for runtime in production. And so I call check property exists. I pass in the string, and then I do a really quick little type check. I go grab the current view model type, and then I try to get the property based on the string that we're trying to raise, the event for. If I can't find it, I do an in-your-face debug.assert, and it's awesome. I unfortunately, I'd love to say I type perfect, but like the rest of us, I get errors. Fat finger a few things, and what it does is it literally pops up a debug assertion message, pretty nasty one, can't miss it, and that lets me know the exact property. It'll say this: invalid property found, the property name, and the full name of the type I'm working against, and that's it. That's all I do. Very, very simple check, but the nice thing is I didn't have to do any lambdas. Yeah, it's not strongly typed, but I don't need that, because this automatically makes it strongly typed for me. And that way I don't have to have overhead of doing a ton of reflection at runtime, which, granted, is minimal, even if you're doing the Lambda approach. There's nothing wrong with it. That's what I do. So, okay, let's see here. So, good question there, Brian. Thomas asked, you mentioned something about a way to avoid using hard-coded. Oh, yeah. I still hard-code the strings. Thomas asked about this. So, going back to my view model, I decided, I tried the Lambda approach, and I'm okay with it, but this is just so much easier. With my little check I just showed you that does that really simple reflection check, I don't have any problems now. And again, if you don't like this, just go search for the property changed and like Lambda. Google it on Bing, as Microsoft would say. And you'll go find there's tons of examples out there now of making this where you'd literally do something like your type, I'll just put T, well, it's not going to like it, but T dot, property name. It would look something like that, in essence. But I go with what I do, and like I said when I started all this, rule number one, there is no one right way. So if you don't like that, I'm okay with that. Go with what you like. Okay, good question. We got about 3 more here. Shira, will the recording of the presentation be available? When Peter or Brian or Asit send me a link, I'll post on my blog. But the LIDNUG guys, they'll take care of that. So I would check them first. And then, yes,
I can answer that one for you, Dan.
Cool.
For those who are still listening, I mentioned at the beginning that we've finally got our new site up and running. Content's still a little bit bare, but the address is www.lidnug.org, and all our presentations will be posted on there, including the past ones and the current ones. Takes us a day or two to get it processed and converted and what have you, but should be fairly quickly.
Cool. So there you go. So answer is yes. Steve asked, can you show how you remove strings in iNotify property change? Okay, that's kind of what I was just showing. I didn't actually build in a sample of doing the Lambda way, but if you do a quick Google search, it's pretty easy to find that if you're interested. So, how secured MVVM as far as MITB attacks are concerned while calling web services? Good question. You're still going to have to watch out for security on your server side. Whether it's AJAX calls or Silverlight calls or whatever. Number one, if you want to be secured with the data that's being passed, of course, you'd have to use SSL. There is no support in Silverlight currently in Silverlight 4 for like WS security, WS routing, addressing, or whatever those are, those specs. That's not built in at the current time. So if you're talking security as far as data security, you would need to use HTTPS. If you're talking security as far as user security, same principles apply. Silverlight doesn't run until the user is already authenticated into the web page. And so just like with ASP.NET, once they've authenticated, you can make your calls back to the server. Well, same thing with Silverlight. Once they've authenticated, that user's credentials by default would be used in order to call the service. So you would serve it, secure it normally. As far as attacks, Silverlight doesn't change that. Same attacks could be run, whether it's an ALA service or cross-site scripting for AJAX services. You still have to worry about that. Okay, final one. Vlad asked, I'm planning to migrate some web apps to .NET, thinking between ASP.NET, MVC, and Silverlight. Is Silverlight a better path to follow? Oh, that's the question of the day. I love both frameworks. I'm a huge fan of ASP.NET MVC, and we build client apps in MVC as well as Silverlight. So although a lot of my blog posts lately are Silverlight, I'm a huge fan of jQuery and MVC. So here's how I would approach it. Number one, there is no one answer. There is just not one answer. It's a great question, and I know that the lame answer everybody gives is it depends on your situation, and that truly is the answer. But let me give you what I would recommend. Number one, if it needs to be as ubiquitous as possible, meaning that everything from a phone to just a browser to something else could hit your site, I would probably go with ASP.NET MVC because obviously with Silverlight you do have to install the plugin. Now it's a teeny plugin, it's like between 5 and 6 meg, but it doesn't work on, obviously Apple doesn't run that or Flash, and it doesn't run yet on my Android phone that I have. So that'd be one consideration. The second is where's your skill sets lie. If you're really good at the web side of things, and like I'm a huge fan of jQuery, I mentioned, I think MVC really encourages jQuery use actually for AJAX calls. Then you might want to go that way. If you want to, there is a little bit of a learning curve with Silverlight, with XAML. I don't think it's insurmountable at all. In fact, I'm working on a web application. As soon as we get done, that's what I got to switch gears to, is a web app. And there's times when I kind of cuss it because I'm so used to XAML. So it really depends on, number one, where's your skill set lie? What are you comfortable with? What's your deployment plan? Who's going to access the app? If it's internal and everybody has Silverlight, that might be I think that's a great way to go. If it's external, it really depends on how restrictive are some clients going to be on getting the plugin installed. So I'll shut up with that one.
Well, I can actually add some fodder to that question for you as well, Dan, because in the past couple of weeks, a project that I've been working on myself, I actually hit this very stumbling block. And what I ended up doing, and some people might think this is a bit crazy, but I built an ASP.NET MVC2 app, and then in the home controller, I put some logic in so that if it detected a desktop browser, it spat out a controller action that had a page with the Silverlight in, and for mobile handsets, it branched it off to a completely different controller and set of actions to format and display the pages as appropriate.
There you go, man. It's genius.
And one of the good things I also found with that as well, we were working with a designer who was very, very precise on his designs, pixel perfect.
Right.
And Silverlight was just so great to use because he produced these really detailed diagrams as PDFs. And I was able to sit down and measure everything pixel perfect in XAML, and then just have dynamic HTML and jQuery and all that produce the UIs that went on the phones and the different devices that weren't desktop orientated.
Cool. So I think that's a great way to go. In fact, for our newer projects we're doing now, instead of creating an ASP.NET Web Forms application, I actually prefer to create an MVC one, much for the reason you're talking about, because now it's really easy for the controller action to have a filter where it can, like you said, load mobile or desktop type content. So,
well, exactly. I mean, the other thing I found with the amalgamation of the two as well is where you're getting data from your backend services. You very often don't have to write services now, or WCF or anything like that. You just hammer out a controller and an action, and then you just control that controller and action as a relative path from within the .NET framework.
Exactly. No, I'm all on board for that. Yeah, it's a great question though. I think Vlad asked that. There's no crystal clear approach. Here's my approach on it. If you prefer, from a maintenance standpoint, to not deal with JavaScript, CSS, HTML, all the calls in between, then I think Silverlight is just phenomenal. Our client app right now, one of the biggest strengths of Silverlight, And that's why it's a hard question for me, because I love both frameworks and we use both frameworks heavily. But my number one feature in Silverlight is the data binding. You just can't beat it. jQuery's currently, Microsoft contributed a really nice a template framework, and they're contributing a data linking framework for jQuery. I think once that comes out, that'll help a lot, but you don't have two-way bindings. Everything's so control-centric. You know, you always got to do your dollar, pound, get to the control with jQuery, and then get to the val method. Whereas in Silverlight, if you do viewModel and MVVM, there's absolutely no worrying about the control at all. You just, if you do it right, you don't even need to name your control. The only time you name your control is when you want to do things like animate it. And that's where Silverlight just literally kicks butt, in my opinion. On our current enterprise app, if we had more time, I'd pull it up and show you guys, but we're not. But it actually has some very serious data binding, like probably a lot of those in the corporate environment. You know, you have just tons of data. To do that in jQuery, and the reason we chose Silverlight for this client was to do that in jQuery and MVC, it would have just been, I don't know, I'm guessing here, but probably 3 times the code. And I'm pretty good at jQuery. I won't say I'm the best in the world, but I know my way around jQuery pretty well. So I'm pretty confident in that statement that it would have just been a lot more code and a lot more maintenance versus going the Silverlight route. Now I'm going to throw in one more thing to keep in mind, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just saying for sure I was agreeing with you on the jQuery aspect.
Yeah, I love jQuery. I mean, I truly love it. I mean, I was just at Intel last week doing a jQuery course for them, and we've done it for a client we just rolled out about 6 months ago, a really heavy jQuery app, and I love it. It's a great thing. But it doesn't have two-way binding yet, and that's the thing that really stands out for me in Silverlight is the amount of code I write is so much less, it's ridiculous if you know how to do it right. And I hear people complain that, oh, that's not true. Well, I don't know, man. I've done it both ways. I've done it with jQuery, MVC, and I've done it with Silverlight. And I think if you know what you're doing in Silverlight, it's actually a lot more maintainable. Now, having said that, you know, there's one more thing I'll point out, and then I'll wrap up here. Printing is not all the way there. And I'm going to go ahead. This is shameless self-promotion. But see, I can't do that, but can I do it here? I don't know how to put it out. But if you go, we had to build an actual product to make printing meet our client specification. And what we ended up doing was, right now printing is pretty much bitmap based in Silverlight, so it's not phenomenal. Now, I will also say in the web world, printing's not phenomenal either, though. You know, if you're in WPF, it's awesome. So one thing I would highly recommend looking into, and Silverlight 5, I suspect they're going to fix this big time, but look at your printing requirements. We actually have a product called Smart Print, and I'll just leave it at that, which is it generates PDFs. And that's what we ended up making out of a result of this project, because the built-in printing, well, there was none in Silverlight 3. In Silverlight 4, there is, but if you have to page and do things like that, it's a little bit painful. You can do it, but you're going to have to write quite a bit of code. So whereas in the web world, it's a little bit easier with CSS because it has the built-in media type support and all that. So that's another thing I would look at if you're doing heavy printing. Hopefully not. I mean, let's save the trees. But if you are, I would look into that as well. So, and with that, I think I'll go ahead and we'll wrap up. I think we've done the questions. Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Dan. It's been a really enlightening presentation. And I'd also like to congratulate you. I think you've got close to being one of the second highest attendee turnouts that we've had, awesome. Next to Scott Guthrie.
Yeah, so, well, you're not going to beat Scott.
Well, I hope you'll consider coming